Hey everyone, and welcome to Video Chess Training. Welcome to my YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and like this video. This is Practical Chess Lessons Part 1. A look at my own game that I played on the internet at a time control of 15 minutes per player. In this game I'm playing the white pieces, and my opponent is rated 1929. With white I played knight to f3, and the game took the direction of a Slav defense. After knight f3 d5, I know that a lot of players prefer to play Reti type of stuff with c4, but in practice it's not easy for white to play after the move d4. Black gains a sort of space advantage at an early stage, and I'm honestly not sure that white can prove an advantage there. So I think better chances are offered with d4. Black plays c6. This is a bit early, but fine. Black can play normally knight f6 first and then decide what to do. I think you keep your options open a little bit more with the move knight f6. If I choose to play something other than c4, c6 may prove to be a slightly inconsequential move. So now c4, going into a Slav defense. And here my opponent plays knight f6, so we start the initial position of the Slav. And I played queen c2. This may look like a strange move for a beginner, but we are protecting the pawn on c4, most importantly, making a kind of waiting move, if you will. Not committing to exchanging pawns on d5, we are not sacrificing any pawns, and we're not committing to playing the passive move e3, which blocks in the bishop on c1. So at this point, I can tell you that many strong players have played this variation, including Garry Kasparov himself. g6 from black is one of the most solid moves black can play. Other moves here include e6 and d takes c4. After d takes c4, white can simply take or imply a very interesting gambit with the move knight on b to d2. This is a favorite of mine. But that's for another discussion. So after this move queen c2 g6, we're in what is kind of the solid main line of black's defense against queen c2 in the Slav. Bishop f4, also the main line. Again, the emphasis here is getting the bishop outside the pawn chain before it's blocked in on c1. Kasparov also has played this with white. Bishop g7, e3. Now this problem is solved. Black can play very actively here in different ways. One interesting move for black is based on ideas of a quick knight a6. But instead my opponent played bishop f5. Castles is probably the main move. Knight a6 is interesting. In bishop f5, even black could experiment with the move c5 there, but I'm not really sure if it's correct. If you want to think about the position, it's sort of similar to a Grunfeld defense, where the queen is somewhat questionably placed on c2. So c5 wouldn't be all that crazy. Bishop f5, a standard move in this line, but not as popular as castles. And now, most of the time in history, as far as this variation is concerned, the strongest players have all played queen to b3. But some mention should be made of bishop d3. This move was played by as strong a player as Valery Salov, who was at one point one of the top players in the world. And I think that it's quite interesting, and still offers white chances of an advantage. The other move, queen b3, sort of flirts with an exchange of queens, so those of you who don't like to allow a trade of queens in the early stage of the game might prefer bishop d3. A kind of classic Slav standoff with the queens here. In general, whoever blinks first in these kind of positions gets a sort of small positional advantage by opening the a file for their rook. Knight to c3, also the main move here. c5 is interesting and playable. I wanted to keep the tension, and then black traded on b3, which is a bit unusual. It's more common for black to castle here, and then white plays c5. This is something of the main line of this variation. Now he's forced to trade queens on b3, and after ab, things are a bit different. I've been forced into the structure where I do have an initiative, threats of playing b4, b5, and a very powerful bishop on f4. It can preserve its diagonal with an early h3, perhaps very soon after this exchange. But in general, this is the path where the majority of the games are heading in this line. But instead, my opponent, obviously a reasonably strong amateur, decided to exchange queens in this game on b3. And this was a bit unusual. Queen takes b3, not really a typical move here. Queen takes b3, a takes b3, knight on b to d7. I think that's fine. And the problem is, if I exchange on d5, he doesn't take with the pawn. If pawn takes d5, pawn takes d5, knight b5, I think that black has some problems based on the a7 pawn and the c7 square. He could, however, take with a knight, hitting my bishop on f4, and leaving himself with a playable position. I'm not that convinced that it's great for black, but I think it is indeed playable. So perhaps it would peter out to a draw in that kind of structure. Bishop e2, this is not my only move, but I do need to get developed. And I think other moves interesting are knight d2 and maybe h3. But as you can imagine, bishop e2 is fine. Now h6, which is partially to give him g5 and preserve his bishop on the diagonal here, but also perhaps in some lines to stop my pieces from going to g5. But every pawn move is a little bit weakening. I think it's fairly standard for this line. h3 for white, with a clear-cut plan of retreating my bishop back to h2 if necessary. And now g5. But the nice thing about this position, whereas normally white plays c5 and induces the trade of queens on b3, in this particular situation, it seems as though I have more flexibility. I can exchange on d5 at some point. Black might give up the center with d takes c. So g5, bishop h2, and now e6, which is something of a lesser of the evils. He wanted to solidify his center. He does weaken some squares. You can consider moves like bishop d6 here for white. I'm thinking the jury is still out on this. It might be even in his interest to play, well, he may be forced actually to play bishop f8 and trade. It's his theoretically better bishop, if you will, because most of his pawns are on white squares. But he is left with some dark square weaknesses. And here, actually, I debated a long time, I remember, relatively long time for this game, as to what to do with white here. And I think there's lots of options. But knight d2 is fair, and I think castles is sort of standard. I would like to have my king in the center in an ending. But there just isn't really a safe position for it. King d2 is just not a safe place. Castle a6, which is sort of inevitable for black, I think. Eventually I'm going to be threatening b4, b5. Perhaps in his given structure he should have delayed it, though. If my pawn was on c5, it would be sort of forced. But here, I'm not sure. He could delay it. Knight d2, I think this is a good move. Obviously, I'm letting up some of the pressure on e5. But most importantly, my knight is ready to capture on c4. And I'm preparing positional plans. b4, b5 with the minority attack on the queen side. And knight b3 to a5, or even possibly c5. Castles for black. Again, same problem as me. He didn't maybe perhaps feel his king safe on e7, as would be standard in this sort of endgame, because of threats of something like c5 and bishop d6 check, perhaps. b4. And here he walked into my trap, if you will. I'm threatening pretty unpleasant breaks with b5, so black thought that he had a good deal here by giving me double isolated pawns, but it's sort of like a fatal positional mistake. Giving up his center, his key point in the center, his bastion, and after knight takes, these pawns prove difficult to attack, whereas his pawn on b7 is very easy for me to attack. I have knight a5, and more importantly, knight d6, invading black's position, where it will hit the bishop on f5 and the pawn at b7. knight d5 from black, which is reasonable, but it doesn't really change the situation. I mean, it gets a piece in the center, it controls the e5 square, but black has problems here. Knight takes d5, not absolutely necessary, but it looked clear to me. And then c takes d5. The other way may be even worse. If e takes, it looks like knight d6, his bishop's hanging, my structure is solid, and I'm just picking off a free pawn on b7. So I thought that this was reasonable. Pawn takes, and then knight d6. And perhaps by taking the way he did, he'll have a pawn break with e5 at some point to try to open up his bishop on the long diagonal. Now, b5, which was not the only move, but I think, again, probably lesser of the evils, doesn't want to lose a clear pawn. And here I missed the best plan, which is a very sort of prosaic and simple plan of rook a2 or even rook a3 and rook on f to a1. Not so much to take directly on a6, but to actually threaten to play bishop takes b5. And I'm going to win both of his queenside pawns, more or less. When the a pawn falls, the b pawn falls. I'll be left up 2 pawns, 2 extra b pawns on the queen side. But I made a debatable decision here, which I think is still okay. I took the bishop on f5 with the idea of breaking up his structure. That my knight was very strong on d6. It's certainly fine to leave it there. And after pawn takes, I decided to play bishop f3. I saw here that he's in a pretty bad situation. If he tries to play his original plan of knight to b6, maybe knight c4, I have bishop c7, hitting his knight on b6 and basically undermining his protection of the d5 pawn. So what he had to do was, after bishop f3, he had to go to f6, which I don't think was his original intention. When his knight will come to e4, maybe blot out the play of my 2 bishops, or at least one of them. So here again I have lots of choices, doubling on the a file, taking the c file. I think in retrospect taking the c file is the fundamental and right move here. For some reason I was unduly concerned about the move g4, which really doesn't help black in any way. So if g4, I could do a number of things. I could play bishop e2, or I could play even bishop d1. I could play pawn takes pawn, and I think white has a very strong game. But instead I decided that I might have back rank problems at some point, and I fixed the pawn on g5. This may seem a bit strange, but it's not really a problem to undouble his pawns for him. In fact, he made a mistake and missed really his only chance, one of his 2 only kind of chances in this game, if you will. He could have played f4, which is a pretty deep pawn sacrifice, pointed out by a computer engine. Now f4, pawn takes f4, and I guess knight e4 here, with pressure on the d4 pawn. It looks like white is better, but black has some counterplay now. If something like pawn takes pawn, pawn takes pawn, rook d1, and rook c8, perhaps black has some sort of counterplay. Rook c8. But it was hard to see, even for a strong player. I'm not sure. So he naturally undoubled his pawns. This leaves his pawns on h6 and g5 with weak squares around them and somewhat fixed and immobilized. So he's left with a very bad pawn structure. Actually, all of his pawns, all 6, are just vulnerable, except for perhaps the f7 pawn. I don't like the other 5. A lot of pawn weaknesses. Rook on f to c8, rook c1, and it's a cute trick here. He doesn't have this move rook c4 because of rook takes c4 and my bishop on the long diagonal. If he plays b takes c4, I have b5, creating a crushing passed pawn, which will be supported by the bishop on h2. So rook c4 loses out of hand. He must play something else. He plays rook takes c1, which eases the pressure on a6 but gives me the open file. Rook takes c1, bishop f8, going after the b4 pawn, and I had seen this, but I found a way to harass the rest of his pawns. Rook c6, knight e4, and now bishop takes e4. And again, it's not the only move, but I thought this simple plan, I was in some time pressure, and I thought this simple plan was best. The following rook endgame looks like a win to me. Bishop d6, if the bishops are traded here, black is tied down to the pawns on h6 and a6, consequently is unable to improve his position in any way, whereas white can bring the king up with king g2 and either try to win the pawn on e4 outright with his rook, or perhaps just play f3 and introduce the king powerfully into the center via e4. White has a protected passed pawn on the d file, and I'm sure this endgame is a win. So black avoided the exchange here to keep the game more tense, which I think was a good practical decision. King g2, f6 to introduce his own king. Of course, this blocks the bishop on g7. It's not a beautiful piece. And at that point, perhaps I could play other plans like rook to c7 to cut his king off, but I thought his king would crawl up to h7 and g6 anyway. Bishop c7, and the plan is d5, d6, d7, d8, which could win very quickly or at least paralyze him total. So king f7, d5, king e8, and now I switched plans. I felt that my pieces would get a little congested if I played d6, so instead I played rook e6 check, and after king d7 I can't win this pawn outright here. But my plan is to, or it was to play rook takes a6. So I wanted to play bishop b6, but I was afraid that perhaps his rook would go to e8. I couldn't calculate it that far. Maybe that's good for me. I can play f3, king e4, king f5. But instead I played bishop a5, which may be debatable. I'm not sure it's quite the best move. And then rook a7, b3, because this pawn could actually be vulnerable. I improved my position before conducting any kind of active exercises. Rook a8, and now f3. And this is the key move. I don't win the pawn, but it's not important. My king just penetrates into the white squares and can even win the bishop on all the white squares at g6 and h7. So black is utterly paralyzed. All of his pawns weak on the 6th rank. Pawn takes pawn, king takes pawn, and then bishop h8. This is what black is reduced to here, utterly in Zugzwang. King e4 and rook e8. And finally, I think that exchanging rooks is winning for white, but I thought this was even more forceful. King f5 and rook takes e6, pawn takes e6 with a crushing passed pawn. The black bishop paralyzed on h8, and the game is soon over. King to e7, bishop to b6, bishop g7. Black is paralyzed with no bishop. Bishop c5 check, and black has a few tricks left. After king e8, king g6, bishop f8. I have to be careful, but I could just exchange bishop takes f8. In time pressure, I didn't want to count the pawn races, but bishop takes f8, king takes f8, king takes f6, followed by h5, pawn takes pawn is winning for white. So instead, I played king takes f6 first, which is equally good. h5, a desperate attempt to get a passed pawn, and e7. This is one of several winning moves. Bishop h6, bishop takes e7, also not good, because if bishop takes e7, my bishop takes e7, it will come back to the d6 diagonal to stop the passed pawn. King g6, pawn takes pawn, and there's a funny finish that you might enjoy. King takes, g3, king takes g5, g2, and e4. The game lasted a few more moves, but I think we should finish here. I hope you enjoyed this practical chess lesson from an actual game that I played in 15-minute chess. I'm International Master William Paschall here for video chess training, and please subscribe and like the video and return to our channel. I hope you enjoyed this original chess content. Bye-bye.